We've got a private company, a huge bank, and a national economic crisis all colliding in a major court case. Today, we're breaking down the ruling in Vihama Energy versus First Atlantic Bank. And, this whole thing really pivots on a question that could affect any of us. Let's get right into it.
So at the heart of this entire legal showdown is one single powerful question. It's something that matters to anyone with a bank account or an investment portfolio. Can your bank just make decisions about your assets, about your money, without getting your permission first? Well, that's exactly what the High Court had to figure out. So here's our game plan for today. We'll start by setting the stage, looking at Ghana's debt crisis. Then we'll zoom in on the specific bonds that started this whole mess. After that, we'll hear both sides of the story, Vihama's and the bank's. Then, the main event, the court's final judgment. And we'll wrap up by talking about why this case is such a big deal.
Okay, so to really get this conflict, you have to understand the pressure cooker environment it all happened in. This wasn't just some disagreement between two businesses, it was a dispute that was basically forged in the fire of a nationwide economic program.
Back on December 5th, 2022, the government of Ghana rolled out something called the Domestic Debt Exchange Program. You'll see it called the DDEP. The country's debt was just becoming unsustainable, and this program was a pretty desperate move to try and fix it. What it did was it basically asked investors to voluntarily trade in their government bonds for new ones. The catch? These new bonds paid a lot less interest over a much longer time.
All right, so let's walk through how this all went down. Vihama Energy had an overdraft facility with First Atlantic Bank, and they used government bonds as security. Simple enough, but when the DDP launched, well, everything changed. On February 7, 2023, the bank called Vihama and asked them to put their bonds into the program. Vihama said no. But then, the very next day, the bank just did it anyway. And that, right there, is when the fight really began.
So let's meet the key players and take a closer look at the exact assets that were right in the middle of this storm.
So let's just lay it all out. You've got the plaintiff, Vihama Energy. You've got the defendant, First Atlantic Bank. The assets in question were valuable Government of Ghana bonds just sitting there as collateral. The bank took those bonds and signed them up for the DDEP, completely against their owners' wishes. So the entire case, the whole thing, boiled down to one question. Did the bank actually have the right to do that?
All right, so now you have the court, and it has to listen to two very different stories. Let's dig into the arguments that both Vihama Energy and First Atlantic Bank brought to the table.
Vihama's argument was pretty straightforward. They said the bank's move was a complete, unauthorized takeover of their property. They said, "We told you no." The bank, though, they argued that this whole DDEP thing created a crazy economic situation, and they had to act to protect themselves. They even went so far as to call the lawsuit a vexatious abuse of the court system.
But here is a critical piece of the puzzle that came out in court. Vihama's refusal wasn't just a quick no over the phone. Their leadership actually went and met with the bank, and they offered to swap out the bonds with other security. We're talking valuable property and big cash deposits to make sure the bank felt secure. And the bank still went ahead and did it.
So, why did the bank push forward? Well, their whole defense was really built on a foundation of fear and pressure. They argued that the DDEP put them in a terrible spot, with huge financial and regulatory risks. They said the Bank of Ghana was leaning on them to participate, and just holding on to those old bonds from Vihama wasn't an option anymore. They felt like they had to act to avoid a huge financial hit.
Okay, we've heard what the company said. We've heard the bank's defense. So now let's get to the main event. What did the court have to say?
The first and maybe the most important question the court had to answer was this: had Vihama Energy actually defaulted on its loan? Because, a bank's right to do anything with your collateral is almost always tied to you, the customer, messing up first.
And the court's finding on this was a knockout blow for the bank. After looking at the bank's own documents, the judge basically said the evidence trying to prove a default was unreliable and misleading, so the conclusion was crystal clear. Vihama had not defaulted, and that meant there was absolutely no good reason for the bank to take control of those bonds.
The court really spelled out the core legal principle here. The judgment says it perfectly. The bank could not act like it owned the bonds. See, collateral isn't ownership. The bank was only allowed to touch that collateral if and when Vihama didn't pay up. Since there was no default, the bank had no right to act, period.
And it goes deeper. The judgment clarified the bank's specific legal role here. It wasn't just a lender, it was a depository partner. Now, what that means is that it was acting as Vihama's agent. And if you're an agent, your number one job is to follow the instructions of your boss, in this case, the owner of the assets, Vihama.
By ignoring that direct refusal, the bank completely breached its duty.
And the judge did not mince words. The court actually agreed with Vihama's lawyer, describing what the bank did as a reckless and fraudulent overreach of authority. I mean, that is incredibly strong language coming from a judge, and it just shows you how seriously the court took the bank's actions.
So with the bank clearly in the wrong, the court had to figure out the damages. It calculated exactly how much money in investment returns Vihama lost because its good, high-yield bonds were swapped for those low-yield DDEP bonds, and the total came out to more than 8.4 million Ghana cedis.
But wait, there's more. The court didn't stop there. It then considered awarding what are called exemplary damages. Now, these aren't just to pay the victim back. They're meant to punish the wrongdoer and send a message. And citing a previous case from 2022, Agricultural Development Bank versus Ali, the court said that these kinds of damages are for conduct that is wanton, fraudulent, reckless, or oppressive.
And since the court decided that the bank's actions fit that description perfectly, it awarded an extra 2 million Ghana cedis in exemplary damages against First Atlantic Bank. This was a clear signal that this kind of corporate behavior just won't be tolerated.
And to really cap off the total win for Vihama, the court threw out the bank's own counterclaim and then ordered the bank to pay another 100,000 cedis to cover Vihama's legal fees.
So, a company won a lawsuit. Okay, but why should this case matter to the rest of us? Well, let's look at the bigger picture here and the really important takeaways from this landmark decision.
This ruling really hammers home a few crucial ideas. First, a bank's right over your collateral is not a blank check. It's conditional. It's triggered by you defaulting and nothing else. Second, when a bank is acting as your agent, its primary duty is to you, the client. Third, being under economic pressure, even from the government, is not a get-out-of-jail-free card to break your contract with the customer. And finally, this case proves our courts are willing to use big money damages to punish and stop corporate behavior they find really, really out of line.
You know, this case was about so much more than just money. It was really about the fundamental relationship of trust between a bank and its customer. And it leaves us with one last critical question to think about. In a time of economic uncertainty, how does a judgment like this redraw the lines of power and reshape the very foundation of trust we have in our financial institutions?